Okay, so this is the central nervous system lecture, the first lecture for chapter 11. Central nervous system, as we know, we learned in chapter 10, is made up of the brain and spinal cord. And the brain stem is what connects the, here, go back. Brain stem here is what connects the brain with the spinal cord. Communication between the brain and the rest of the nervous system, so the peripheral nervous system out to the body, happens through the spinal cord. Central nervous system is protected by these meninges, and if you remember back to AMP1, when we talked about the meninges, when we were talking about the tissues, they were these tissues that surrounded the brain and spinal cord, and now we'll get into a little bit more depth with them. So start with the dura mater, and the dura mater, get back to my pen. Okay. The dura mater is the most superficial layer, so the one furthest from the brain and spinal cord. And dura mater actually means tough mother. Within the dura mater, we're going to have these sinuses. So like what we see here and here. Okay. The dura mater, and then if you were to do the sheep dissection, you would notice that the dura mater was extremely tough. It's hard to even cut or tear. The arachnoid mater is so called because the arachnoid mater has these little spider web-like projections that go into the subarachnoid space. All right, so we got the subarachnoid space, and you got this arachnoid mater that's going to cover them, or from where they're coming. There's something called cerebrospinal fluid that we'll talk about in the next few slides, but right now we'll just abbreviate it CSF. That's within that subarachnoid space. And then the pia mater is actually the meninge that covers the brain. It's one in contact with the brain. And then pia mater means, well, the literal translation is soft mother, but it's also the place where the blood vessels are found within the meninges. Okay. Sometimes people get infections in here, viral infections, bacterial infections, and it causes inflammation of the meninges or the surrounding tissue, and that's called meningitis. And this is just another view of the meninges on the spinal cord. So you see you got this very thick dura mater, the arachnoid mater, below the arachnoid mater in this space. It's even a little bit easier to see it here, is that subarachnoid space with the cerebrospinal fluid, and then the pia mater directly connected to the brain and spinal cord. Ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. There's 4 ventricles that make up the cerebrospinal fluid. You got the 2 lateral ventricles. All right, so you got these 2 lateral ventricles here and here. So that's the ventricles 1 and 2, but we just call those the two lateral ventricles. And they are called the first and second. Then we have the third ventricle, which drains the two lateral ventricles. And then the fourth ventricle here. Between the ventricles, allowing them to communicate with each other, and when we say communicate, we really just mean stuff to flow in between them, we have the interventricular foramen. And then we have this cerebral aqueduct that's going to drain the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. When the cerebrospinal fluid leaves the fourth ventricle, it's going to go down into the central canal of the spinal cord, which is just very thin, especially as you get down deeper, it's very thin. Okay, and this is just a lateral view of what we just talked about, with the lateral ventricles, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct communicating with that fourth ventricle, and then down to the central canal of the spinal cord. All right, let's talk about cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is secreted by the choroid plexuses. Now, when we talked about some of those, the cells in chapter 10, we talked about the cells that produce this material. And I don't know if you can recall the name of those cells. So the choroid plexuses is where the cerebrospinal fluid is actually secreted from. And it circulates through the ventricles, central canal of the spinal cord, and the subarachnoid spaces. So as it comes down here in the central canal of the spinal cord, it will come back up in that subarachnoid space. Okay. The cerebrospinal fluid completely surrounds the brain and spinal cord. It helps to stabilize the ion concentrations in the central nervous system. There's also some cushioning effect to it. And the cushioning effect is particularly obvious when someone has like a spinal tap or an epidural, and they lose some cerebral spinal fluid, and then when that happens, the brain actually has less cushioning, and they get very severe headaches from that. Okay. If you have too much cerebral spinal fluid or any wasted cerebrospinal fluid, it gets absorbed here in this arachnoid granulations. The fluid itself, we don't have a lot of fluid. It's only about 120 milliliters of fluid. But it does carry nutrition, and like we said, it protects it. The fluid is clear, and it's a very similar composition to blood plasma. All right, talk about the spinal cord. Spinal cord is just this kind of slender column of nervous tissue, starting, it's continuous with the brain, well, through the brain stem. It goes all the way down through the vertebral canal. Remember, it's going to extend through those vertebral foramen. Begins at the foramen magnum. That's where the start of it is. And it really terminates here at that the first and second lumbar vertebrae. in that space. So that's where kind of the termination is. And then the conus medullaris is the continuation of it, and the cauda equina is the kind of the end of it. The structure of the spinal cord. Really, this is the posterior portion of the spinal cord. This is the anterior portion. You have you've got these horns, and that's a good place I need to start. So you've got these posterior horns, and you've got anterior horns. From these posterior portions, we have these dorsal roots that come out. And then they move anteriorly and move into something called the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, here's that central canal here, where the cerebrospinal fluid is going to flow through. There's the white matter and the gray matter. And we haven't talked a lot about white matter and gray matter yet, but we will. But basically, if you remember from chapter 10, the white matter is the myelinated tissue, and the gray matter is unmyelinated. But we'll get more into that. These funiculi, or singular funiculus, we'll talk about more, and it's in a table. But we've got posterior funiculi and these anterior funiculi, and then these lateral funiculi. Okay, so the posterior, anterior, and lateral funiculi. And these are just areas of the spinal cord where specific tracts of nerves are running. Okay, and this is just showing some of those different portions. Yeah, this is a little bit out of order with the book, but I like to talk about this so that when we talk about the actual parts, you have a frame of reference for why those parts are where they are. Okay, so reflexes are these autonomic reactions. Okay, remember the autonomic reactions happen without us actually thinking about it. So they're these subconscious responses to stimuli, and they happen within or outside the body. We have a simple reflex arc, and the simple reflex arc starts with just a receptor. Now, a receptor is somewhere in the PNS, and it receives a signal. So it could be a light signal, it could be a pressure, touch receptor, some receptor somewhere, could be a pain receptor, and it sends a signal to the central nervous system. Now, really what we're talking about here is, for the most part, we're going to be talking about the spinal cord. And then there's some immediate motor output. Now, it doesn't just have to be the spinal cord, but that's the one that's kind of most important for these reflexes. And then this motor signal, that efferent signal, gets sent back out to an effector, which is a muscle or gland, to tell it to do something. Okay? So that's just a simple one. Now, the more common reflex arcs are the ones where you have a motor receptor sending a signal to some association area of the brain, and then back out to a motor neuron, which will go to the effector muscle gland. Okay, and then this table just has your what the different parts of a reflex arc are. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to remind you of, and we only touched on it in A&P1, was the idea of an interneuron. And interneurons communicate between neurons in the central nervous system. So between neurons in the brain or spinal cord. All right, general components of a spinal reflex arc. So we'll start here with up here with some receptor. So let's just say this is a touch receptor. The signal gets sent to the spinal cord, and then there's this interneuron, this purple one, this interneuron in the spinal cord that allows the signal to jump over to some efferent neuron, some motor neuron, to tell the body to do something. Okay, tell this muscle to react or contract. Right, reflexive behavior. So this is just a simple monosynaptic reflex arc. So this one is the knee jerk one, where you have your patellar tendon right here is going to be hit with that hammer, and it's going to cause some stretch receptors in here to send a signal to the spinal cord. So the signal goes up to the spinal cord, and this is really protective in that if this thing is overstretched, this muscle is overstretched, it could tear. So when we hit this, we don't want this muscle to be overstretched. We don't want it to tear. So the signal goes to the spinal cord, and notice there's no interneuron here. It's just a direct connection right back to the muscle to tell the muscle to contract and extend the knee. Okay, so that's the knee jerk reflex. Okay, and it's a simple monosynaptic, so one synapse. Okay, and the whole purpose of this reflex arc is really to just maintain an upright posture. This one is a little different. Okay, with this one's called the withdrawal reflex. Withdrawal reflex. Put it up here. Oops, I forgot my A. Let's try that again. There we go, withdrawal reflex. So this one is you get a little pain receptor here, and you step on attack, and it sends a signal to the spinal cord. But for this one, there is an interneuron. It requires it to jump over. Now this one's going to be a little bit delayed, not much obviously, but it's going to tell these muscles in the back of the leg to contract and then pull the foot away from that. So if you're walking along and step on attack, that's what would happen. Now, try to think about why you would want to have that interneuron. Why wouldn't you just want to pick that leg up as quickly as you possibly could? Like with the knee jerk reflex. Well, it's because of this. because if you have that withdrawal reflex and you just pick your leg up very quickly, and because you're stepping, now remember when you walk, you have put pressure on one foot, but take pressure off of the other. So if you just pick that up very quickly, you're going to fall. And that's why this reflex arc is paired with the withdrawal reflex, because you get something called the crossed extensor reflex. So the crossed extensor reflex also sends a signal over. So we just stepped on the tack, got it here. That interneuron sent a signal over to the muscles in the leg where the tack, the leg that was stepping on the tack. And remember, the flexors contracted to pick the leg up, the extensors relaxed, but also it's going to jump across to the other leg, and it's going to tell the flexors on that leg to relax and the extensors to contract. And this is why if you step on a tack, you don't fall just from picking your leg up, because you're also wired to make the other leg stiff. And this is so it's protective in that we don't want to fall. Okay, tracts of the spinal cord. Tracts of the spinal cord, there's a lot of them. There's a table in your book, and the table is on page 418, and it's table 11.7. And it has the nerve tracts of the spinal cord. This is just kind of these general areas where nerve pathways happen. So you've got these lateral corticospinal tract, and that lateral cortical spinal tract is just a pathway for nerves. So the lateral cortical spinal tract is a descending tract. So the signal's heading down the spinal cord from there. So from the brain down. Okay, and that one, it's going to take the signals that have to do with voluntary movements from the brain out to the skeletal muscles. Okay, now these are a huge pain to try to learn and to try to memorize, because the words are so similar and they are kind of words you haven't seen before, and the information is pretty dense. So my suggestion for people trying to learn these is to break it up into the ascending tracts and the descending tracts, just like the book has it. And then make actual flashcards. And on the flashcard, put just the name of the tract on one side, and then very bulleted list of things on the other. Like, for example, for the lateral corticospinal tract, the book is probably way more wordy, but I would just put motor impulses, brain to skeletal muscles. That way, you're not trying to get you're not trying to memorize all the words that go with it. So in the book, it's going to be a lot more wordy. Actually, let me just look at the book, see. So yeah, so in the book, it has conduct motor impulses associated with voluntary movements from brain to spinal cord. If you just put motor impulses from brain to spinal cord, brain to skeletal muscles, you already know that the skeletal muscles are voluntary. so that you don't really have to have all those words in there. So try to simplify the language with this a little bit when you're looking at it. Okay, we'll stop there.